Welcome to Curious Tales and Tours. Today, the day that cheered up America.
It's nice to be nice. I like courtesy. I value politeness, courtesy, and don't particularly like confrontation. If it's absolutely necessary, then you do it. But I mean, generally speaking, we would try, all of us, I think, would try not to do that.
On February the 9th, 1964, a cultural revolution began with a single broadcast. The Beatles, four lads from Liverpool, made their debut on the Ed Sullivan Show, forever changing the landscape of American pop music. This iconic moment was seen by over 73 million viewers, marking a watershed event that ignited the fervour of Beatlemania in America. It wasn't just a performance, it was the beginning of what we now know as the British invasion. But just how did this momentous occasion come to be? The American composer Bernard Herrmann, who had a keen ear for talent, had been in Liverpool in 1962. He brought back with him early parlophone records of the Beatles, and he set about trying to convince US record companies of their potential. Despite these efforts, major labels were skeptical. Herrmann did not have much luck. It was actually talent booker Jack Babb, after seeing the Beatles live in the UK, who finally ignited the spark. A pivotal moment occurred on October 31st, 1963, at London's Heathrow Airport. The celebrated presenter Ed Sullivan himself witnessed a sea of 1,500 fans at the airport awaiting the Beatles' return from Sweden. Sullivan, impressed by this frenzy, decided it was time to bring them to his show. And then, in the blink of an eye, Beatles manager Brian Epstein flew to New York, and within only a few days he and Sullivan had struck a deal. The Beatles would perform 3 shows, 2 live and 1 taped. The Beatles landed in New York on February 7th, 1964, and they were greeted by over 5,000 eager fans. This arrival marked the beginning of a new era in American music. However, it wasn't without its challenges. During the rehearsals for the first performance, George Harrison was sidelined with strep throat, but the show went on. Beatles road manager Neil Aspinall and a couple of the backstage crew stood in. The live broadcast on February 9th was a spectacular success. The Beatles opened with All My Loving, then followed it by Till There Was You and She Loves You. The crowd's reaction was unprecedented, and it set a record for US television viewership that stood for 3 years until a season finale of The Fugitive took the record.
It's like when people later would see the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, live from New York, the Ed Sullivan Show.
I meet a trillion people who say, that, I knew that's what I wanted to be.
Last Sunday, on our show in New York, the Beatles played to the greatest TV audience that's ever been assembled in the history of American TV.
When I saw you four-headed monster on the telly, I knew I've got to be part of this. Our current manager of Beatles Apple Records says that. Bruce Springsteen says that. David Letterman says that. They all formed on that night, formed this future for themselves. And there we were in Liverpool forming this future in the same kind of deal.
Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Olympic gold medalist Terry McDermott poses with the band, and the excitement is palpable. The Beatles returned to the Ed Sullivan Show on the 16th of February and the 23rd. Each appearance drew massive audiences, and it solidified their status as international superstars. Then in August 1965, the Beatles made their final live appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, with performances of I Feel Fine, Help, and a few more. This influence continued with promotional clips that kept them connected with their American fans. Even after they ceased performing live, the Beatles continued to make waves with promotional clips, sending Ed Sullivan rare, exclusive videos for some of their greatest hits. And so the legacy on The Ed Sullivan Show endured. Their appearances became a touchstone for future musicians and pop culture. Decades later, the Beatles' impact, of course, endures. From the K-pop band BTS's homage to the 50th anniversary of their first appearance, to Boy Genius recreating the Ed Sullivan set, the reverberations of their groundbreaking performances are still felt to this day. The Beatles' debut on The Ed Sullivan Show was more than a performance. It seems it was a cultural milestone. On a personal note, of course, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas. The mood in America must have been one of despondency. Perhaps the arrival of the Beatles and the positive music that they promoted may well have signalled, if not influenced, a change in the American psyche, which carried on through the decades.
I've always known that people in listening to your song may take a message away. So that if your song is a good message, love is all you need, then that's a good message to put out rather than sympathy for the devil.
It heralded a new era in music, one that continued to inspire and captivate audiences around the world. So as we look back, we see this was not just a moment in time, but the dawn of a musical revolution. Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Gene Simmons, and Joe Perry, amongst others, cite watching the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show in the 1960s formed their musical careers. Thanks for joining me on Curious Tales and Tours. Do please subscribe, share or like, and I'll see you very, very soon.
We continued on in that direction. We'd be in Piccadilly Circus and then the road Piccadilly. We'll take a little detour down Chinatown. Now, talking about places that were heavily bombed in the Second World War, the original Chinatown was. And the original Chinatown was in Limehouse in East London. And so the Chinese community decided that they needed somewhere else. And this rent in this area was one of the cheapest in London, if you can imagine that, right in the centre of the West End. During an interview years later with Francois Truffaut, the great French film director, Hitchcock said his father once sent him to a police station at the age of about 4 or 5 with a note. Now, for some reason, Alfred maybe had been naughty. The chief of police read the note, put him straight in a cell, and locked the door for 10 minutes. When he let him out, he said, "This is what we do to naughty boys." This might explain the guilt, the fear of the police. Hitchcock himself never worked out why he was there, but he always had a sort of distrust of the police in a lot of the films that he made. You have St. Martin in the Fields Church and St. Martin's Lane. So if we carried on in that direction, we'd be going up Charing Cross Road. And if we continued straight, we'd be at Charing Cross Station. Charing is an old English word for turning in the river. And in the 1200s, Eleanor of Castile passed away, and her husband, King Edward, decided to mark her funeral procession from Lincoln to London with 12 crosses, and the final cross before her coffin reached Westminster Abbey was at the turning in the river. So that's why we say Charing Cross to this very day.
That very day, As the train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at a carriage window by my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver. "Stop!" He shut off, he put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, I heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments and was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us.